A poor student married a 71-year-old wealthy woman. 7 days later, he was shocked to realize the truth. A gray sky loomed over the small college town in Texas, its streets slick with rain. Mark Davis trudged along the sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face etched with worry. At 23, he was juggling his final year of law school, a part-time job, and an avalanche of debts left by his late father. The world seemed to close in tighter every day. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. Mark Davis speaking, he answered. A composed, authoritative voice responded. Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation. Mark frowned. I'm sorry. Who are you? How do you know about? I know enough, she interrupted smoothly. Let's meet at Brooks Bistro. 7 p.m. It's important. The call ended before Mark could protest. Confused but intrigued, he made his way to the upscale cafe. The rain fell harder as he arrived, his jacket doing little to keep him dry. Stepping inside, he was greeted by warm lighting and the aroma of fresh coffee. At a corner table sat Eleanor Brooks, a striking woman with silver hair styled impeccably, dressed in a tailored suit that radiated wealth. Mark, she greeted, gesturing for him to sit. Her tone was calm yet commanding. Mark hesitated before taking the seat opposite her. Mrs. Brooks, what's this about? Straight to the point. Good, she said, sipping her tea. Mark, I know about your debts, the ones your father left behind. I know you're barely scraping by. I'm here to offer a solution. Mark's brows furrowed. And what would that be? She set down her cup, her piercing blue eyes meeting his. Marry me. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Mark blinked. Sure he'd misheard. Excuse me? You heard me, she said, her voice steady. This isn't about romance. It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, ensure your financial security, and in return, you'll be my husband. Mark let out a disbelieving laugh. You're serious? Why me? You don't even know me. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Exactly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love. Mark, I need a companion, someone to share my name, my estate, and nothing more. Think of it as a contract. Mark shook his head, his mind racing. This is insane. What's in it for you? Her expression softened for the first time. I've spent my life alone. Mark, I have no children, no family left. I want companionship, even if it's just for appearances. And I want control of my legacy. A husband will help solidify that. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. I can't. I need time to think. Of course, she replied coolly. But don't take too long. The offer doesn't stand forever. Mark walked home in a daze, the rain soaking through his clothes. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his mother, her pale face etched with worry. The cost of her treatments had drained them both, and his younger sister's tuition loomed like a dark cloud. Mark, his mother said softly after he explained Eleanor's proposition. I know it sounds unthinkable, but if she's willing to help, maybe it's worth considering. Mark stared at his hands, torn between his pride and his desperation. You're asking me to marry a woman I don't love just to solve our problems? I'm asking you to save yourself, she said, her voice trembling. To save us. The following morning, Mark returned to the bistro. Eleanor was already there, her demeanor as calm and composed as before. You've decided? She asked, not looking up from her tablet. Mark took a deep breath. I'll do it, she smiled faintly, setting down her tablet. Good. The arrangements will be made immediately. A week later, Mark stood in a small courthouse, dressed in a suit Eleanor had provided. The ceremony was quiet. witnessed only by Eleanor's lawyer and a notary. As they exchanged vows, Mark couldn't shake the unease in his chest. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Eleanor turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." As they left the courthouse, rain drizzling once more, Mark looked at his reflection in a puddle and wondered, have I just saved my family or sold my soul? The gates to Eleanor Brooks's estate creaked open as Mark's cab rolled up the long driveway. The house loomed ahead, a sprawling mansion that could easily pass for a museum. Its towering columns and pristine stone facade exuded old money, but its windows seemed dark and lifeless. Mark stepped out, suitcase in hand, feeling like a visitor in someone else's dream, or perhaps nightmare. Eleanor greeted him in the foyer, her demeanor as polished as ever. "Welcome, Mr. Davis," she said, the formal address sending a shiver down Mark's spine. "I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction. Dinner is at 7. He nodded mutely, following a housekeeper who led him to his room. It was opulent, with a king-size bed, antique furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked manicured gardens. Despite its luxury, the room felt cold, as if untouched by human warmth. That evening, Mark sat stiffly at the long dining table. Eleanor was at the other end, dressed impeccably in a silk blouse and pearls. The food was extravagant, prepared by a chef he hadn't seen yet and served by staff who moved silently. "I trust you're settling in," Eleanor said, cutting into her filet mignon with surgical precision. "It's different," Mark replied cautiously. "This place is huge. Feels like I'll get lost." Eleanor smirked. "You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, you're here." Mark bristled at her bluntness. "You didn't mention much about your late husband before." Eleanor's knife paused mid-cut. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin before speaking. "He was a businessman, like your father. Their paths crossed once or twice." Her tone darkened, but as you might imagine, not all encounters end well. Mark's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her eyes sharp. "Let's just say unfinished business has a way of lingering." She picked up her glass of wine. "But that's in the past. You'll soon understand why I chose you." Her cryptic words left Mark uneasy. After dinner, he wandered the halls of the estate. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of floorboards underfoot. He passed several locked doors, their brass handles gleaming in the dim light. Each one seemed to whisper secrets he wasn't meant to know. As the days passed, Mark grew more unsettled. The staff avoided eye contact, speaking in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't listening. He overheard snippets of conversations that made his stomach twist. Why him? Does he even know? She never does anything without a reason. He'll figure it out eventually. They always do. One evening, while pacing the library, Mark noticed Eleanor's desk. Papers were strewn across its surface, along with a small, ornate key. It gleamed under the desk lamp, its intricate design catching his eye. His gaze darted around the room. No one was there. Heart pounding, he reached for it. The key was heavier than he expected, cool to the touch. Mark's mind raced. Could this be for one of the locked doors? He glanced toward the hallway, where shadows danced against the walls. His breath quickened as he slipped the key into his pocket. That night, lying in his luxurious but suffocating room, Mark turned the key over in his hands. A million questions swirled in his mind, but one loomed above all. What is Eleanor hiding? And why had she really chosen him? The mansion was shrouded in stillness when Mark crept down the hall. The key felt like a lead weight in his pocket, its cool surface pressing against his thigh. His pulse quickened as he approached the door he had noticed earlier. its ornate handle gleaming faintly in the moonlight streaming through the windows. Glancing over his shoulder, Mark turned the key in the lock. The soft click reverberated in the silence, sending a chill down his spine. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room was a time capsule, frozen in another era. Dusty furniture and faded wallpaper surrounded him. Photographs in tarnished silver frames lined a table, their images capturing happier times. Eleanor as a young woman, a man who must have been her late husband, and another couple Mark didn't recognize. But it was the stack of papers on the desk that caught his attention. Mark flipped through them, his eyes widening. Legal documents detailed failed business deals between Eleanor's husband and Mark's father. A particular letter, written in sharp, slanted handwriting, accused Mark's father of fraud. "You ruined everything. My family was left with nothing because of your lies." His breath hitched when he noticed the last page, a marriage license. His name and Eleanor's stared back at him, stark against the paper. It was dated weeks before the wedding, far earlier than he'd known. On the desk lay an old leather-bound diary. Mark hesitated, then opened it. The entries were Eleanor's, revealing a calculated plan to trap Mark in a marriage that would fulfill her ultimate goal, to settle old scores. "I will take everything from him, just as his father did to me. He will be my pawn." Mark froze as the door creaked behind him. "Enjoying yourself?" Eleanor's voice was icy, cutting through the shadows like a blade. He spun around, guilt and fear writ large on his face. "Eleanor, you thought you'd find answers here?" She stepped into the room, her silhouette sharp against the dim light from the hall. Curiosity killed the cat. "Mark, what do you think you're doing?" His voice was low but firm. "Why did you really marry me? Is this about my father? Is this some kind of revenge?" Eleanor's eyes hardened, her usual composed facade cracking. "It's not your place to ask questions. Mark, just do what you're told, and you'll leave this marriage better off than you started. Isn't that enough for you?" Mark's fists clenched. "Enough? You've lied to me, manipulated me. This isn't a marriage, it's a trap." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "A trap, is it? Maybe you should have thought twice before signing those papers." She stepped closer, her tone venomous. "You may think you're smart, Mark, but you're just like your father, blind to the damage you cause until it's too late." Mark glared at her, the weight of his father's legacy crushing him anew. "If you hated him so much, why take it out on me? I had nothing to do with what he did to your family." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching like a taut string. Finally, she turned on her heel. "You're in over your head. Mark, stay out of matters that don't concern you." With that, she left the room, her footsteps fading down the hall. Later that night, Mark lay wide awake in bed, his mind racing. Eleanor's words haunted him, but so did the documents and diary. Why had she gone to such lengths to entangle him in her schemes? Was it really just about revenge? His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of Eleanor's voice. He slipped out of bed and crept toward her study, pressing his ear against the door. "Make sure the transfer is complete," Eleanor said, her tone sharp and commanding. "We can't let him back out now. Time is running out." Mark's blood ran cold. Whatever was happening, he was in deeper than he'd ever imagined. Mark sat alone in the grand library, his mind a whirlpool of fear and confusion. Eleanor's cryptic words and the damning contents of the locked room made it clear he was in over his head. The once imposing estate now felt like a gilded prison, its luxurious trappings concealing dark secrets. That evening, Mark approached Mr. Harris, the estate's head butler, a man whose calm demeanor suggested he'd seen and heard more than he let on. "Mark," Mr. Harris, I need your help. Something isn't right here, Mark said. The older man regarded him with a steady gaze, his hands clasped behind his back. Mr. Harris, I was wondering how long it would take before you came to me. Mark, you know something, don't you? About Eleanor. About all of this? Mr. Harris hesitated before speaking. You're not the first young man to be drawn into Eleanor's world. Mark, she's clever, resourceful, and ruthless when it comes to her goals. My advice, watch your back. Mark's chest tightened. Why are you still here if you know what she's capable of? Mr. Harris's expression softened, a flicker of regret passing across his face. Some of us don't have the luxury of walking away. Determined to find a way out, Mark began devising a plan. He reached out to a trusted friend from law school, Peter, under the guise of catching up. Mark, Peter, hypothetically, if someone signed a contract under coercion or false pretenses, is there any way to void it? Peter replied, hypothetically, yes, but it depends on the evidence. Why? Are you in some kind of trouble? Mark deflected. Just a class project I'm working on. Thanks. Man. The next few days, Mark carefully searched Eleanor's office whenever she was away, hoping to uncover something that could explain her obsession with his father. Late one night, as he rifled through her desk, he found an envelope addressed to his father. The letter was a scathing condemnation written by Eleanor herself. It accused Mark's father of embezzlement, fraud, and deceit that had led to the financial ruin of Eleanor's family and, ultimately, the death of her husband. You left us with nothing. My husband's heart couldn't take the stress, and he's gone because of you. I will see to it that your family pays for what you've done. Mark's stomach churned. Eleanor's actions weren't just about reclaiming her fortune. They were about revenge, fueled by years of pain and anger. Returning the letter to its hiding place, Mark resolved to act. He couldn't allow Eleanor to use him as a tool for her vendetta. That night, he began mapping out possible escape routes from the estate. But Eleanor's sharp instincts caught wind of his unease. The next morning, she found him in the breakfast room, her icy presence cutting through the quiet. Eleanor, Mark said, you've been busy, haven't you? She said. Mark froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. I don't know what you're talking about. Eleanor smiled coldly. Don't play coy with me. Mark, if you think you can outsmart me, you're sorely mistaken. I've dealt with far craftier opponents than you. Mark swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I'm not doing anything wrong. Eleanor leaned closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. If you betray me, you'll wish you hadn't. Remember that. She straightened and left the room, leaving Mark to grapple with the growing realization that escape might be more dangerous than staying. But staying meant surrendering his life to Eleanor's twisted plans, a fate he refused to accept. The air in the estate felt charged as Mark paced the library, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his shoulders. The private investigator he'd quietly hired had just left, confirming the devastating truth. Eleanor's late husband, Harold Brooks, had been swindled by Mark's father in a fraudulent real estate deal that stripped the Brooks family of their fortune. Harold's death from a heart attack soon after was the final blow, leaving Eleanor embittered and determined to exact revenge. Eleanor's proposal to marry Mark had been more than a calculated plan to settle scores. It was a way to make his family suffer, even from beyond the grave. Mark clenched his fists, anger coursing through him. How could she blame him for his father's sins? But as much as he resented Eleanor's actions, he couldn't deny the pain that had driven her. That evening, Mark met his law school friend Peter in secret. With Peter's help, he compiled the evidence he had collected from Eleanor's office and the investigators' findings. Among the documents, they discovered Eleanor's involvement in current business dealings that bordered on illegal. shady partnerships, and falsified reports designed to rebuild her empire at any cost. Peter said, "Mark, this is enough to take her down, but you need to be careful. If she realizes you're onto her, there's no telling what she might do." Mark nodded grimly. "She's already done enough damage. It's time to end this." The next morning, Mark waited in the grand sitting room, the evidence tucked securely in his bag. When Eleanor finally entered, her icy composure intact, he stood to face her. "Mark, we need to talk." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Her tone clipped. "Is that so? What could possibly be so urgent?" Mark's voice was firm as he pulled out the documents. "I know everything about my father, about Harold, about what you've been doing to rebuild your fortune." For the first time, Eleanor's calm exterior faltered, her eyes flicking to the papers in Mark's hand. "You've been snooping again, haven't you? Do you even understand what your father did to my family?" Mark stepped closer, his voice rising. "I understand that he wronged you. But what about the people you've hurt along the way? What about me? I didn't do anything to deserve this." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "And my family deserved to lose everything? My husband deserved to die of stress and heartbreak while your father lived comfortably? Don't talk to me about fairness." Mark's hands shook as he held up the evidence. "Revenge won't bring him back, Eleanor, and it won't undo what happened. You've spent your life consumed by this, hurting innocent people, ruining lives. When does it end?" Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Mark thought he saw something close to regret in her eyes. Softly, she said, "You remind me of him. You know, Harold, that same fire, that same stubbornness. I didn't expect to feel anything for you, Mark, but here we are." Mark hesitated, caught off guard by her admission. "If you really feel that way, then stop this. Let it go before it's too late." But before Eleanor could respond, the sound of car tires crunching on gravel echoed through the estate. Moments later, uniformed police officers entered the room, followed by Peter. "Ms. Eleanor Brooks, we have a warrant for your arrest. You're being charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy." Eleanor's face hardened as she looked from the officers to Mark. "You called them?" Mark met her gaze, his voice steady. "You left me no choice." As the officers led Eleanor away, she turned back to Mark one last time. "Eleanor, you may think you've won, Mark, but revenge isn't so easily undone. Be careful it doesn't consume you too." Mark watched her go, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. He had exposed the truth and protected himself. But the weight of Eleanor's parting words lingered. Was she right? Would the shadow of their shared past ever truly fade? The gavel's sharp bang echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of Eleanor Brooks's trial. Mark sat silently in the back row, watching as the once commanding woman he had married faced the consequences of her actions. Despite everything, his testimony had helped reduce her sentence. He hadn't done it out of sympathy, but out of a deep understanding of the complexities of their shared story. Eleanor turned briefly in her seat, her gaze meeting Mark's for the first time. There was no trace of the cold calculation that had defined her before. Instead, she offered a faint, almost apologetic nod. Days later, Mark was summoned to the estate one final time. The grand house, once intimidating and isolating, now felt empty. Eleanor had arranged for him to receive the property's deed. The estate lawyer handed Mark a letter in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. It was never about the money, Mark. It was about closure. Harold deserved justice, but I lost sight of what truly mattered. You've shown me something I thought I'd forgotten, the capacity to move forward. This estate is no longer a monument to my pain. It could be something more. Use it well. Mark sold the estate, a decision that came easily. Its grandeur had been a gilded cage for both him and Eleanor. The proceeds allowed him to pay off his family's debts, finally freeing his mother from the shadow of his father's mistakes. With the remainder of the funds, Mark established a scholarship fund in Harold Brooks's name. It was a way to honor the man who had unknowingly become a casualty in the feud between two families. Mark's return to law school felt like a homecoming. This time, he was more determined than ever to use his education for good. He interned at a legal aid center, helping individuals who, like Eleanor, had been wronged and left without recourse. One crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived for Mark. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. He sat on a park bench near campus and unfolded the paper. Eleanor's letter read, "Mark, I've had much time to reflect. For years, I believed that revenge would heal the wounds Harold's death left behind. But I see now that revenge is its own prison. Your kindness, even in the face of my mistakes, taught me something I never expected. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength. Thank you for being better than the world around you. Thank you for showing me that we can break the cycles we inherit. I hope you find the happiness I never could." Mark stared at the letter for a long time. The words sinking in, he folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, feeling an odd sense of peace. A year after Eleanor's arrest, Mark stood before a group of scholarship recipients at a small ceremony. Behind him hung a simple plaque, the Harold Brooks Scholarship Fund for Second Chances. Mark spoke with conviction. This fund isn't just about money. It's about creating opportunities for those who might otherwise be forgotten. It's about turning pain into purpose. After the ceremony, he sat alone for a moment, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past year. His path had been irrevocably altered, but for the first time, he felt he was walking in the right direction. Mark walked away from the ceremony, a soft smile on his face. He glanced up at the clear sky, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting. Eleanor's letter remained in his pocket, a quiet reminder of the lessons they both learned about redemption, justice, and the transformative power of forgiveness. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of resilience, redemption, and forgiveness. Mark's story reminds us that even in the face of betrayal and hardship, the choices we make can lead us to healing and new beginnings. If this story touched your heart and left you inspired, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends and loved ones. Let's spread the message of hope and second chances far and wide. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories for more heartfelt tales that move your soul and remind us all of the power of compassion, forgiveness, and love. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with another soul-stirring story. Until then, take care and remember to cherish the lessons life brings.